Hello everyone, welcome back. So now we're going on to create our log system. We've got all of our history states being generated and they're being saved within our history manager. And we can go back and through all the different history states that we've saved, and we can go and revisualize everything that we've already been through in the story. But one thing that we want to add on top of this is the ability to go back and just look at the logs. So not to go back to each individual state, but to just go back through a list of all the dialogue that has been run through the screen. So if you want to go back and see what was said at a previous point, you don't have to navigate through it all. You can just pull up the log menu and go scroll up or down and find the text that you're looking for. So that's what we're going to be building today. For us to do that, we're going to implement two new scripts. So let's go into our scripts section. Over here, scripts core, and back into our history folder, we're going to create the first script, which is going to be a history log. The history log is going to represent a visual element on screen that has a container as well as name text for who's speaking and a dialogue text for what they said. And then the second script that we're going to have is something to manage all of that, which will be a history log manager. The manager's job is to create a log for every state inside of our history manager. So we will go through and let's just go ahead and define what's going to be in our history log. So let's think about what the history log is going to need. The best way that we can do this is to just go ahead and visualize it right here and now and build the system or the panel that it's going to exist on inside of our screen. So in our render groups, we've got the main render group, which has a main camera and the main canvas. We've also set up at the very beginning of this series an overlay. We're going to put our history log in this overlay. That way, when it comes to screen captures, this log system will not be captured in screenshots. So we can go ahead and enable our camera as well as our canvas. And I'm going to move my camera overlay into the same spot where my camera is for organization. So the first thing I want to do is if we come into scene view, we'll notice our cameras are not sized the same. So I want to make sure that my camera overlay has the same settings as my camera main. My main is set to orthographic with a size of 5, so overlay should be set to orthographic with a size of 5 as well. And now we can see they're operating on the same space. Now my overlay as well is using screen space camera on the overlay camera, and we're doing the same thing on our main camera. So it looks like we're good. So let's go ahead and define what this is going to look like. Inside of our overlay, let's make a new panel. So UI panel, where is it? There we are. And let's call this history logs. Now for the panel, we're not going to need this white background, so we'll just go ahead and remove that. But we are going to make a sub panel here, and we're going to make this a container for everything that's going to be inside of this history logs panel. So we'll just add a new sub panel, and whenever the logs come up, I want the background to just go a little bit darker. That way it brings more attention to the logs on the screen. So let's give it a black background, and so we can control the alpha and of everything inside of this panel, let's give it a canvas group. Next thing, we will be giving an animation to this panel, so that way when we call for the logs to show up, it can fade in and rise up. So let's give ourselves an animator. And we'll make those animations shortly, but right now let's make the content. So in the panel, let's make a new object, which will be a scroll view. This scroll view, let's go ahead and just scale up to the size of the screen here. About this size would be good for me. Next, I made the background of this scroll view black, so that way it'll darken the center where all these logs are contained. And let's grab both of the handles for these scroll bars for the horizontal and vertical axis, and just change their color to something that looks a little nicer than plain white. I'm going to go for a slight gold look. And I will just add a title over top of this. So we'll make a new Text Mesh Pro. I'll label it as history logs and place it directly above the scroll view. Then we'll also configure a slider, at which point we can go ahead and either make the text larger or smaller in our logs. That way we make it easier for ourselves to read. So I'll click in the panel again, create another UI object, and choose a slider. I'll make the slider fit the color theme of the rest of this panel. Now let's go ahead and generate our little log. So this log is going to go inside of the scroll view, under the viewport, under this content field. This content will already be masking everything that'll be inside of it, so our history logs will not be visible outside of this content area, which is good. That's what we want. So let's start by making a new image. We just want a background. And this background is going to span the width of this little content field. And I'm going to move it to the very top and just make it a little smaller. I'll make it a dark gray, again, so it fits nicely with the theme. Then we want to create two text items, one that will be for our speaker name and one that will be for the dialogue. I've chosen to call them name text and dialogue text. So let's go ahead and position them where we want them. Name text, I'm just going to default with speaker name as the text, and I will move that all the way over to the left-hand side. And I'll shrink this down to, let's say, maybe 18 for the default size. Just scale that up a bit. And then center it about where I want it. I'll do the same thing for the dialogue text. I'll make sure that this is set to 18, and we'll configure that size for the text in the script. But just for visualization here, here's where we're going to put that, line it up with the speaker name, and then just scale the dialogue all the way to the other side. "18 was a little small, so I decided to go with 26 instead. Now for the name text, let's make sure that we set the anchors to the bounds of this rect transform. Everything should scale appropriately based off of scale to screen size, but I'm going to configure these anchors anyway, and just make sure that if I want to change this box in the future, then I can do so directly within the editor, and everything will maintain their proportions. There, and we've got our little prefab for a history log. So we know that we're going to need a little image container, and I'll call this a container. Actually, I'll call it a log. So the log is going to consist of a background or container object, as well as text for the name and text for the dialogue. So we can configure that within our history log script. Let's open up the history log, make sure we're in the history namespace, and let's configure those fields. We're going to start with a game object for our container, which will hold all of the other items, and then our name text and dialogue text. And since every character can have customized text, let's also configure their size. The color doesn't matter, and the font being used doesn't matter because we'll apply that to the text objects themselves. But we will need a reference to the actual size in comparison to the other text, or the default text size, for any given particular character. I'll configure these as the name font size and the dialogue font size. And that's all we need for our log, just a reference to all of these values. So the log manager is going to generate logs on the fly. It's going to generate one for every single state, and each log might have a different amount of text, so they'll need to be of different sizes. So we'll need to configure some values that will allow us to customize the size of these logs and fit them within the content view. So let's start with the starting height. The starting height of the log before any calculations are made. So we'll say private constant float log starting height. And I'm going to default this to 2. We might change that later. Now let's define the amount of height that's added for every line that is generated in this text. So if something is 2 lines high, then we'll add some extra height to it. So private constant float log height per line. And again, I'll set that to 2. Now, in order for us to calculate percentages and to know how big this log has grown, we'll go ahead and make a default height as well. So we'll have ourselves a default height that is just assumed to be the size of the log if it is at a perfect like one line. So private constant float default height. And I'll just set that to 1. Again, we might come and change these later. It might take some toying around. Now, we have a slider at the bottom, which will allow the player to just drag that and configure the size of the logs to their liking. So we'll store this in a private variable called log scaling. And then let's go ahead and define a default text scale. So we know that the dialogue system has a default font size, and all the characters have their own font scaling. But the logs and the dialogue system are not the same size. So we might want to shrink down the text in the logs compared to the dialogue system, or have them bigger, whatever might be your fancy. But we'll define that here. So we'll make a private constant float, and this will be the text default scale, which I'm going to set to 1 and just have it the same size as what we would see on our dialogue panel, and we'll see how that looks. Now, we've also got an animator that's attached to this thing. That way we can fade it in and fade it out. So let's go ahead and grab the animator. So we'll do serialize field, private animator, anim, and we'll get the log prefab as well. So serialize field, private game object, log prefab. So we can spawn new ones in. Next, we'll want to reference to our history manager. So history manager, that way we can grab all the logs. We'll call that manager and set that equal to the history manager.instance. And then we want an internal list of all of our logs that have been generated. So we'll make a private list of those history log types and call this the logs and set that equal to a new list. Next, we can open this thing and close it at will. So let's define a boolean that will tell us whether it's open or not. Public bool is open, get private set, and we'll default that to false because it's going to start closed. And then we've got that slider, which we can use to allow the player to customize the size of the logs. So we'll have this as a, we'll do it as a private. So we'll say serialize field, private slider, the log scale slider. And there we go. So let's go ahead and start with opening our log panel. If we press a certain key, then we'd like it to show up on screen, and we'll just use the animator for that. But we'll run it through a function, which would be a public void called open. And what open is going to do is it's going to check if is open. If we're already open, return and do nothing. I don't know why it gave me that. So if we're open, do nothing. Otherwise, we'll call anim.play, and we're going to play a particular animation. We haven't made any animations yet, but the animation that we're going to make is simply going to be called open. And then once that's done, is open equals true. Now we can just copy this and do the same thing for close. So we'll say close. So if not is open, return. Otherwise, cause the animator to play close and say is open is false. Now, as for what those animations are going to be, let's go ahead and select our panel, which has the animator component on it for our history logs, and let's make sure we're in the animation tab. So let's create a new animation. Inside of main animations, let's go in UI and make a new folder for history. And inside of here, I'm going to call this log open. And so log open is going to make this thing appear for us. So let's go ahead and hit the record button. And with our panel open, let's go ahead and just tick interactable and block raycast so they are true on start. That way, whenever this thing is opened, it will become interactable and we can interact with the scroll view here. And let's also set the alpha to 1. Now, since we're also going to be adding a little fancy movement to this thing. Not really fancy, but just give it something so it's not just fading in, but it's got some motion to it. We'll also set the position. So I'll drag this panel just back to its original spot. That way we log it here. So we should have the alpha, the blocks raycast, and interactable, as well as the anchored position for this panel. And I will copy that and paste that at 1, so we now have an open animation. This is the open state, so let's go ahead and define one for when it's closed. Create new clip, log, close. Oh, actually, my open state needs to start invisible first, so at the very end, everything's going to be visible, and we're going to have our interactability up. But at the start, I'm going to make sure my panel is actually at 0 alpha, so that way it will fade in. I just need to record. So there we go. Then it'll fade in, and I will start the panel down just about right there. And that would look like this. So in the game view, what we'd see is something like that. Our history log would fade in and come up. Now for when we close, we're going to do the opposite. So we can have our log open here, and we can copy the very last frame, paste that at the beginning of close, and then copy the first frame of open and paste that at the end of close. And then what we get is just the reverse. But let's make sure for close that we go ahead and make sure that interactable and blocks raycast are both false on both of the frames. Now, since I want this to start closed, I don't want it to start with this animation where I'm going to see it closed, but I want it to already be closed. So I'm going to make a new animation called a log closed, past tense. And then I'll just take close and copy the last frame there and paste that for both frames in log closed. So we see nothing and it's completely invisible. And I'll just go ahead and do the same thing for log opened and take log open, copy the last frame from there, and paste that in the beginning and the end of log opened. And then let's open up the animator. And since I want it to start invisible, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that log closed is the one that is set as the default state. And whenever I open, I'm going to make a transition to log opened, and whenever I close, I'm going to make an ending transition to log closed. These transitions, we want to make sure that they have an exit time, and that exit time is set to 1, so it's at the end of the animation, and the transition duration is 0, so it's an immediate transition to opened and closed. Setting those up and linking them in our open and close function will allow us to have visibility over our history logs. Now let's go ahead and define what happens when we try to add a log. Whenever we create a new history state, we're automatically going to create a new log. So we'll do that through a function called public void, which is add log. And what we're going to take is the history state, which we're going to copy. So the history state will be the state, and we'll just get the information that we need from this. But let's go ahead and make sure that we are following the same cache limit that the history manager is using. So let's first do a check. If logs.count is greater than or equal to the history manager.history cache limit, then we know we've exceeded our limit. And if we have logs, then we want to go ahead and destroy the first log in the container. So we'll say destroy immediate, and we'll reference logs 0, the very first one, and reference the container. So we're going to destroy that log. And then let's go ahead and remove it from our internal list. Logs remove at 0. Otherwise, if we're within the cache, or after we've removed it, then we're going to create a log. So let's make a new function. Public void create log. And this is also going to take a history state. So history state state. And then we'll just call create log and pass in the state at the end of add log. What we're going to do when we create the log is, let's go ahead and create a cache for this new log that we're generating. We'll start by defining a history log called log and set that to equal a new instance. The first thing that we need is we need to generate a new container. So our log.container will equal a new prefab that we instantiate into the scene based off of the reference that we'll have in our editor. So we'll call instantiate, and we'll instantiate the log prefab, and we'll go ahead and make sure that it's parented to the scroll view content, which would be the log prefab.transform.parent. And I want the log to actually start invisible, or rather not start invisible, but I don't want this top log being visible, so I'm going to take that log and just disable it in the scene. That way it's not visible and it's not going to be in the content. We'll just duplicate it and then enable the ones that we do use. So when we create a log, let's say log.container.setActiveTrue. And now we need to get the name and dialog text of this. So log.nameText. Let's go ahead and grab the TextMesh Pro object. This is going to come from our log.container because we're going to find the children. We've already got the name text and the dialog text as children of our container, so we can just call the find command on their transform, and we'll find the child based off of the name. So I'm going to define a constant up above. Private constant string name text name. And this is going to be what I called it inside of the Unity editor, which was name text. And I'll do the same thing for dialog text. That way we'll get the right names as constants. So when we're looking for this child, I'm going to look for the name text name. But I need to get the component of the TextMesh Pro UGUI type. And we'll do the same thing for our dialog text, changing name text for dialog, and then dialog text name. Now it's time to populate the text with the details of the character, including the current speaker and what they're saying, as well as the customizations of the text for the color and the font size. So let's check and see if we actually have a speaker on this line. If not, then we're just going to hide the name text. So we can do that by checking the dialog data inside of our history state and seeing if we have a current speaker. So let's say if state.dialog.current speaker equals string.empty, then we're just going to say log.nameText.text equals string.empty. And we're not going to show anything. Otherwise, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and set the name text to the speaker. So we'll say log.nameText.text equals state.dialog.current speaker. And let's get the font, so that way we're using their same font as well. Log.nameText.font equals, but because the font in our history state is a file path and not an actual font asset, we need to load it from the history cache. So history cache dot load font, and we're going to load the state.dialog.speaker font. After we've got the font, let's set the color. Log.nameText.color equals state.dialog.speaker name color. And now our log has another variable for the size of the font. So we're storing the size here because we're going to set the font size of the text to whatever a value that we compare against the log scaling and the default size. But we want to maintain that for when we both generate the log and for when we go on in the future and manually adjust that slider. So, which is why we're caching the font size inside of the history log instead of just setting it on the text. So let's go ahead and cache what we're going to generate for this log. And that's going to be the size of the font before we do any kind of log scaling to it. So log.nameFontSize will equal the default scale, so text default scale, and we're going to multiply that by the state.dialog.speaker scale, which is actually the font size. And then let's go ahead and apply it to the text itself. So log.nameText.font size is going to equal the log.name font size, and we're also going to add in some text scaling. This text scaling is going to be whatever kind of scale we have set for our log. So when we move that slider, we're going to change this text scaling value, and we're going to tag it on to all of the font that's generated and any font that's edited. So let's go ahead and say plus text scaling, even though we don't have that variable yet. Let's go up and define that. So private float text scaling is going to equal a certain value. I'm going to say it's going to equal our log scaling multiplied by some sort of value. And I'm going to do 3. So whatever our log scaling is, multiply our font size by 3. And then we should get some pretty good scaling for our text. So that's for our name text. Now let's go ahead and take care of our dialog text. And our dialog text is going to use much of the same stuff, so we can go ahead and copy this whole section, paste it, and just change out name text for dialog text. So dialog text.font. We'll make the dialog text equal to the dialog.current dialog. And the log dialog text font will be from the dialog font. The dialog text color is going to equal the dialog color from the state, and the dialog font size will equal the default scale times the dialog scale. And then the dialog text font size is going to equal the log.dialog font size plus the text scaling, just like we did for our name. And once we've finished that, we can go ahead and say logs.add, and we're going to add this newly generated log into our list. And come to think of it, I do not want this public, I want that to be private. Whenever we add a log, we're going to then call create log. So that's why we're doing it that way, by adding it directly into the list, because it's already doing the check up here. So this is just setting the size and all of the customizations for the text, but it's not changing the size of the log itself, and we want to make sure that we do that. So when we add this log to the list, let's go ahead and scale the log as well. Let's make a new function down here, private void, and we'll call it fit log to text. And we'll take in a history log as our parameter. So before we add this to the list, let's just go ahead and make sure that we fit it. So fit log to text, and we'll pass in the log that we've just created. So we'll go ahead and auto size it and then add it to the list. So when we're trying to set this thing up to scale, we need to make sure that our text components have some certain components attached to them. We're going to need to know what size our text wants to be. So let's go ahead and just add some stuff to our text variables here. So our content, first of all, if I go ahead and duplicate these logs, they're all just staying in the same place. What I actually need is a vertical layout group, which means these logs need to have a layout element on them. So let's give a layout element and go ahead and check preferred width and height, so it sets it to the default for these items. And I'm going to do our content and add a vertical layout group, starting at upper left, and control child size width and height. Now you notice my log went all fat there, so I'm going to go ahead and add a content size fitter as well, and change vertical fit to preferred size, which will take the preferred size of the log. So my log is just a little small. I'm going to make it 36 or something like that. Maybe 40. Okay, that'll be enough. And then name text and dialog text, we're also going to add a content size fitter there as well and set vertical fit to preferred size. And for the content, let's go ahead and set some spacing. I'm going to separate each entry by 5 and just set a padding of 5 to all the different corners. And if we go ahead and duplicate these logs, then we should get them stacking on top of each other. And now our logs are basically going to tell us what size they want to be, and we'll be able to scale them appropriately and scale the whole image to fit. So let's start by getting the rect transform of our dialog text. Since the dialog text is going to have the most stuff in it, we'll use that to gauge how big our log should be. So let's get ourselves a rect transform and call this the rect, which is going to equal the log.dialogText.getComponent rect transform. When we have the rect, let's go ahead and get the content size fitter as well. So the content size fitter, and this will be the text content size fitter. So that's going to equal the log.dialogText.getComponent content size fitter. Let's go ahead and analyze the text here. Say text csv.set layout vertical. So we're going to be analyzing how big it needs to be, not horizontally, but vertically. We'll do it that way. And then let's go ahead and grab the layout element group so we can get the height and all of that stuff that is configured in there, including the preferred height, so we know how big this thing should be based off of its text. So layout element, we'll call it log layout equals log.container.getComponent, and we'll call the layout element. Once we've got this layout element, let's go ahead and see what the current height of this log is. We'll cache this in a little value because we'll be doing it with some math in a second. We'll grab it from rect.height, and let's figure out what the scale of this log is in comparison to the default height that they start at. So float pers for percent equals height divided by the log default height. And now let's find out how much bigger this thing needs to be based off of the lines that it has. We'll call this extra scale. So float extra scale, because this is what's going to be applied to it. And we'll start with the log height per line, and we're going to multiply that by our percent. So this is the size of each line multiplied by each line that we have. But we only want to do that for every extra line, so anything but the first one. So we'll just go ahead and subtract that by the log height per line. So we're only running this scale on every extra line that we have, because we've already got the default size for the one line. It's already in there, so we don't need to incorporate that. What we do want to do is now we want to grab the total scale for this log so we can apply it to the preferred height of the log layout. So we'll grab that as float scale, and this is going to equal our log starting height plus the extra scale. And now let's set the size of the log. So log layout dot preferred height is going to equal our scale plus our text scaling. And just so it's not scaled so tightly to the text, let's go ahead and add some padding to this as well. So we'll say log layout dot preferred height and plus equals 2 multiplied by our log scaling. So it'll give us some comfort room there. So when we do this, we should go ahead and generate all of our logs and fit them to the size of the text. Before we go testing this, let's go ahead and do two more things. One of which is going to be when we modify that slider, we need to be able to change the log scaling size. So let's make a little function for that. This one needs to be public because it's going to be accessed from the slider. We'll say public void set log scaling. And we're going to say that log scaling is going to equal the log scale slider dot value. Which mine is not history log manager slider joint 2D. Okay, so that auto completed the wrong thing for me. we are using the Unity Engine UI. There goes Visual Studio adding a bunch of namespaces I don't need. So yeah, we need to make sure that this is a slider, not anything else. Say local or log scale slider dot value. So that'll be our new log scaling. And then we need to go through each history log that's already been generated and just update its size. So for each history log in logs, let's go through and calculate the size. Log.nameText, let's get the name text first, .font size equals a certain value. We've already cached the default size from when it was generated, which takes into account the character customization. That is log.nameFontSize. And we just need to add the new text scaling, which would be updated once we get the new log scaling. So we'll do that for the name font size, and we'll also do that for the dialog font size. Dialog text, rather, dot font size equal to log dialog font size plus text scaling, and then all we need to do is say fit log to text and go ahead and specify the log. There we go. So when we move our slider, we should go ahead and scale all the logs with it. And then the next thing, we'll go ahead and just clear our logs. Maybe there would be some point where we would actually want to clear these things or just reset it. So let's go ahead and make a little variable or function that we can do that with. Public void clear. For every one of our logs, we're going to destroy the container and clear the list. So for int I equals 0, while I is less than logs.count, I++. Then let's go ahead and destroy immediate logs I.container. Once that's done, logs.clear. Clear the list. Not sure when we would actually do this, as it would be tied to the history manager, but there it is in case we need it. Now that's all well and good, but we need to have our logs generated when the history state creates a new history state. Whenever we get a new history state, we need to also get a new log generated. Let's go to our history manager for this, and down where we log the current state, let's go ahead and grab our new log. But we'll want a reference to our log manager for that. So we've got navigation here. Let's also make, we're going to want the player input to access this too, so that way we can start showing the logs. So we'll make a public log or history log manager and call it the log manager. Make it get and private set. Inside of awake, we will say log manager equals get component history log manager. So then let's also require the type history log manager, so they are all tied together. And once we log the current state, then let's go ahead and say log manager dot add log and add it from the current state that we have captured. So in Unity, let's now link this stuff up. Let's go ahead and link up our animator and our log prefab, as well as the log slider. Now the log slider needs to have an event added to onValueChanged here. Anytime the value is changed, we want to reference the history manager and access the log manager and then tell it to set the log scaling. So that way it'll update whenever we move it. Next thing, we want to link this to our player input manager. That way whenever we click a certain button, we'll go ahead and show or hide the logs. So let's open up our visual novel input actions and add a new action for history logs. And this key I'm going to set to the tilde or whatever that is. Which means now with the new action, let's open our player input manager and add this into our script. So we'll go ahead and make a new function down here. I'll copy the onHistory forward and just change that to onHistory toggle log. And what I'm going to do is access the log manager dot open. So let me just actually grab the log manager first. So var logs equals history manager dot instance dot log manager. And then let's check if logs dot is open, or if it's not open, then we'll go ahead and say logs dot open. Otherwise, if it's already open, logs dot close. Now let's link the action. So history logs, and we'll do on history toggle log. That way it's linked to our input now. So let's come into Unity, make sure that our default log is disabled because we don't want that visible. And I'm going to go ahead and make sure that my history logs is just invisible off the bat, turn off interactable and blocks raycast so I can see the screen. And let's go ahead and just save Unity and start playing and test out what we've built so far. Okay, so I click and we should have one log generated, so I'm going to press my key. And I get a warning saying state could not be found. Oh yes. So that's because we set our log states to be open and close, but we have them named log open and log close. To fix that, we could just rename log open to open and log close to close. And then it'll be able to find the animations. So let's go ahead and try that again. There we go. Okay, so I now have one log generated. And if I drag this slider, I can scale it up, not by much. Oh, how about I change the value on my slider? Let's come down to the slider and say that the max value instead of 1 is going to be 5. And we'll set it to whole numbers, that way we get little increments. Now let's go ahead and restart it. We shouldn't have any issues, so I should be able to bring up the logs right off the bat. Nothing in there. So let's click. We should have one that's generated. We should have 2 now, which we sure do. We've got 2. And let's go ahead, get some names showing up. There we are. Okay. So now we have a bunch of logs that have shown up. And since that's a little small, I'll just drag up my scale a little bit. And you could scale this up to your liking. Let's skip and get a couple more. And we can see that more logs have been generated. And it's also only allowing us to have as many logs as we have defined in our cache limit for the history manager. But this now gives us a list of all the dialogue that we can go back and read in case we wanted to look over what we've already read. Maybe we missed something and we want to go back and see what it was. So now we have the option to go back in our history states. Oh, well, how about that? That's an issue. I'm glad I did that. We need to make sure that the choices actually show up and hide if we're working on our history states. We'll go ahead and take care of that in the next part, because we've gone ahead and taken care of our logs here, and I'm going to end this episode off now. So this is a lot that we've covered, but we'll go ahead and take care of that little issue with the choices and even the input. That'll happen with the input as well. So whenever we're moving back through history, we don't want to be able to do that if we're currently being presented with a choice, or if we are, maybe we don't want it to still have that choice or that input up when we're going backwards or forwards. So we'll fix that in the next part. I'll see you guys then. Bye.